Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this legal insight session run by Kaizen Synergy Law Firm. My name is Nihal Samara. I'm the General Counsel and Legal Director here at Kaizen Synergy, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's session. Today's session is going to revise and review the cybersecurity governance standards, and we're also going to look at the impacts of the new financial governance standards and legislation covering this area. We thought it important to actually go back and review the cybersecurity governance standards, just given in light of the recent Optus events and also what the impact that this has directly on charitable organisations. As always, we'd like to pay respects to the traditional owners of the lands on which we all meet from today, and we pay our respects to the traditional owners of the elders past, present, and future. So today's agenda is going to look at the governance, risk, and compliance standards, focusing on reviewing the cybersecurity requirements and also the financial standards. Now, given that this cybersecurity issue is actually real, it is something that has been across the media in the last few days and is also building, considering what the impacts of these have been. That said, I will just draw your attention back to those agencies that have joined us over the past few weeks as well too during these legal insight webinars, where we had actually at the start of September started to talk about and given a specific legal insights webinar just on the cybersecurity governance standards and focused on community service organisations. We will be reviewing this given the requirements that agencies do need to meet as part of our suite of legal webinars that we are running. So just to review and give you direct access to your resources in terms of what you all need to and should be looking at as part of your good governance standards, is essentially a number of resources that we will circle back to, but I will just show you where these are on your dashboard. You do have access to our Gemba 360 governance risk and compliance dashboards, where you can actually conduct self-assessments specific to your organizations and get an idea as we're moving through these topics over the next few weeks on specific areas that we are covering off. So how you actually get to those, let me just bring you back to this as well too. For those of you that are new to this as well, you can access the Gemba 360 dashboard by simply going to gemba360.com. I will type that into the toolbar up the top here that you can see. And once you bring that up, it will bring you to this circle. What you will all get access to as part of attending these webinar series is access to this dashboard. Essentially, it is your governance, risk, and legal compliance dashboard in and having everything in one spot. What we will focus on is this particular governance, risk, and compliance self-assessment tool that you can see in the bottom left-hand corner. When you click and open that up, and I will just do that for you now, you will see this particular dashboard here. From here, what you can do is click on add a new entry, and it will come up with a range of questions, some of which we are going to go through today. But when we look at, for example, cybersecurity, and we are going to discuss this a bit and review these, it will ask you what do you have in place, and it has a number of specific questions. These are based on the ACNC requirements, as well as ASIC and ACMA and a range of other compliance objectives that you need to follow. What we do have as well too, which I will add, is if you do have any questions while you are using your own self-assessment tool, you can simply click on this button here and start the chat now process as well too, and someone will pop up and give you a hand All you need to do is put in your name, email address, and the agency that you're from as well. So this is there for yourselves to be able to access as part of that. The other parts that I will mention as well too is that there are a range of policy templates that you can also access, and we will be covering these off as part of your cybersecurity and also your financial compliance obligations. You can access those by simply clicking on the Gemba docs. That will bring up this screen here, and what you'll be able to view is a range of specific topics. And if I go into this and click on policies, for example, then you'll see that we've got access to financial, cybersecurity, safeguarding, and working with partners. And that covers the specific governance standards that we're going to look at over the next few weeks as well too. And we'll be updating this for you to be able to access these templates. But it is a really simple way of you being able to access some of these specific areas and topics, and also getting an idea of some of the policy documents that you can view as well too. As I mentioned, if you do have any questions, you can reach out to us. We will be moving on to next week, governance, risk registers, and reporting, which is something from a risk register point of view you should be managing as part of your good governance standards. So let's just have an overview of where we're sitting at the moment in terms of your resources. You can see we've got the Gemba dashboard, and we've just marked the risk register, which we will be looking at next week. So essentially your governance standards, before just jumping into the cybersecurity area and the financial requirements, is that these arise under a number of specific regulatory agencies and legislation. We do find that these arise under the ACNC good governance standards, but also under your ASIC, if you're an ASIC registered company, where you might be a company limited by guarantee, or if you're an Aboriginal or Indigenous community controlled organisation under the Office of Registrar for Indigenous Corporations. What you will find essentially is that there are a range of specific legislative and compliance obligations that you need to meet. These include specific legislation on enhancing online safety. It also broadly includes protecting children from within an e-safety perspective as well too. But essentially what you've also broadly got is your corporate governance obligations that your agency needs to meet. This does mean that essentially you have clear objectives and functions, and that your members understand and your clients understand the rules and objectives of your agency. This, I'll talk very broadly. It does include Indigenous corporate governance as well too, which must be performed in terms of other governance arrangements that your agency also needs to meet. There are significant fines for not meeting good governance standards, and your obligations are that you should, and your directors and officers must meet these obligations within your agencies. I can see essentially that, and Michelle, thank you for asking the question. Just asking, is this accessible to anyone in the webinar? Absolutely, Michelle. We have opened up the legal resources to be able for those that are actually attending the webinar, and you will, and your agency will get its own login to be able to access these as well. In terms of the PowerPoint slides and also the recording, we'll also make these available for you to be able to access. So essentially what we are seeing across the board is a number of broadening of these standards in terms of the expectation that regulators are expecting agencies to meet. Again, whether you're an ORIC registered company or an ASIC registered company, essentially these are consistent in terms of your obligations. Now, there are a range of governance standards that you do need to meet very broadly, and essentially there are 6 of these that we have covered off over the past number of weeks now. I will just touch on each of these as we go through the session this afternoon. But essentially there are penalty units for not meeting these particular standards as well. And there are areas that agencies really need to ensure that they meet their obligations. Now, what we are finding as part of this is that the toolkits that we have put together really focuses on a number of key areas. And one of these is financial abuse and the other is cybersecurity. We are going to jump and go to cybersecurity just as to revise this given the current environment that we find ourselves. And we're going to come back briefly to financial abuse and actually look at what your obligations actually are. As we covered off these cybersecurity requirements in your agency, what we do find is that cybersecurity is a current issue. What agencies currently struggle with is, what does this mean for me? Well, essentially, all charities are vulnerable to cybersecurity risks. This is something we discussed back in actually the start of September, well before the Optus issue actually arose. Now, recognizing issues of cybersecurity and how they may affect your organization is crucial for charities. It is important that charities know how to best mitigate the risks of cybersecurity and can address issues that arise. Now, these slides have been taken, which I will add directly from the ACNC and also ASIC sites as well too. We will be building on these. We're not funded by agencies. We're not representing any of those regulatory bodies. We are an independent law firm, which allows us to actually comment further on what we see as key areas that your agency does need to actually consider. What we are finding on this is when you actually then need to meet this standard, agencies turn around to us and say, where is the line in the sand and what do we actually need to do in terms of meeting these requirements? Well, if we go back to your legal resources, what we can see is essentially what we've brought up is both a policy document in terms of what your agency needs to meet and also the resources that sit alongside of this as well. Now, let me just bring this up for you and show you what we mean here in terms of what your agency does need to consider in terms of its obligations. Now, I am just going to jump directly into the legal resources here. Here we are here, and you can see what we've got on your screen. Now, with this, what does this mean for your agency? Well, essentially, if we go to the governance, risk, and legal compliance form, I'm just clicking on this here. Here we are here. It'll just come up, and I'm going to do this live for you. Essentially, what it asks you under the guidelines is, does your agency have clear policies, guidelines, and procedures for cyber security? And essentially, agencies then turn around to us and go, what on earth does this mean? And where is the line in the sand that we need to meet this? Now, what we have got for you is your data management and cybersecurity policy. Here it is here. It is a Word document that you can actually start to utilize, and essentially we've set it up so this way you can actually place in my agency name and search and replace all the information. What we have done here for you essentially is to take the individual standards that you need to meet as part of this and also mark this off for your agency to see. So if I go into this particular site here, and let me just bring this up and I'll show you what we mean by this. Essentially what we've got here is the cybersecurity standards. You can see that we've got that listed here. And if I just highlight this whole section in terms of what you need to look at, here we are here, it's highlighted for you. And what we've then gone back and done is select each one of these particular areas for you as well too. So idea is that you've got a real starting point for your policies. You can adopt this, or alternatively, you can look at changing these all together. The policy document that you've got talks about keeping email safe, protected company devices, what you actually need to do from a legislative compliance point of view for employees working, and also things like document retention and document destruction as well too. one of the clear areas that we often come up with is how long do we actually need to retain electronic information for? There are new legislation, well, when I say relatively new legislation, it's been around for some time, where there were changes in Victoria and New South Wales and even South Australia under their Crimes Act for the retention of certain documents and how long your agency needs to keep these for as well too. We also see these in Tasmania and Western Australia. I'm just highlighting these for you. And we've just had a couple of questions in terms of agencies asking us what happens if we don't work, for example, in Victoria or Tasmania. Is this policy relevant? Well, quite simply, what you can do is highlight the section. I'm just doing it for you live. Here it is, Victoria. You can delete that out. And if you don't work in, agency doesn't operate in Tasmania, for example, you can delete those sections of the policy document out, and the rest of the document will remain the same. So in terms of that document, you can have access to this. What this does show you essentially is, what does your agency do? I'm just bringing it back in terms of, do you arrange training for staff on cybersecurity and privacy issues? Do you conduct assessments into terms of weaknesses? Do you respond to data breaches, etc.? Do you regularly update things like your antivirus software and the likes? So you've got the checklist here on the minimum requirements. If you do type yes or no, they are just yes or no type answers. And then if you have other comments, you may even say, we have reviewed the policy and adopted this across our organization. Or you may have another IT company that you essentially use, and you can say, this is managed by ABCD IT company. So you get the idea of how this works, and you can then save that, and you've then got a copy of that registration of how you meet these particular governance standards within your agency. And it's really as simple as that. We will be showing you next week in terms of how you actually need to meet your risk register requirements, and also looking at more broadly your reporting obligations within your agency as well too. And we will have this within the risk register that we're showing you here. Now, let's just jump back to the financial abuse and requirements that charities need to meet. As I mentioned, we held this over from last week and Monday just past to today, because we wanted to include some of the key requirements that your agency does need to meet. Now, under financial abuse requirements that have come up, what we are finding is that agencies need to essentially meet a number of key obligations. In particular, what does this mean for you? Well, financial abuse is a term that covers a number of issues. It includes possible instances of bribery, corruption, financial fraud, and improper use or misappropriation of community services funds. It is critically important that all charities have an understanding of financial abuse and are confident that they have the knowledge and processes to be able to mitigate the risks and address these issues. Now, for agencies, what does this actually mean? And we are going to unpack this a little bit for you. So if I go back to my legal resources, this is essentially the checklist that we use when agencies approach us on financial compliance obligations and what they need, what their minimum standards that they actually need to meet are. So I've just clicked on the self-assessment form, and what you can see is that we've got a number of key items that your agency needs to consider. We are just going to go through this and show you what we look at for this. Now, essentially where this list comes from, again, is under the ACNC guidelines, but also we've looked at the legislative risks and added comments into this, which I will just discuss now with you. So essentially, under the financial abuse, when you are looking through this, and again, we've been asked, I can see questions coming up, who would actually do this within each agency? This can be done by a finance officer. It can be done by one of the directors or a company secretary, or even compliance officers if you have those as well. So essentially the idea of this is that your agency's charitable purpose are clear, and it ensures that all activities and funding are actually directed directly um, on the specific areas that we can see on this. Now, the financial we will actually look at this in terms of how do you actually meet the requirements. So essentially what you need to look at first of all is what is the charitable's purpose, and ensuring your activities directly correlate to what you are actually doing. On it, what we look at is what are the services that you are delivering and how can you do this at the moment. And so with it, the other part that agencies look at is, well, does all of our activities need to be directly under our direct charitable purposes, or can we have a number of these directly on there? So essentially what we do have is, what we've said to agencies is, not all of your services need to be directly under your objectives, but the majority of those do. It is a little bit confusing in terms of how that works, but what we do find is that essentially majority of your services do need to be covered under your specific objectives that you do see. Now, with it, does your agency have a documented financial abuse risk assessment? We are going to be looking at this next week. It is one of the key areas to actually look at, but essentially doing this checklist will get you started in terms of what you have. Now, it is a fairly detailed process that we have, but there is no issue in actually saying, no, we don't have it at the moment. We will be actually going into your risk register and actually conducting and showing you how to conduct it next week for you as well. Keeps a list of its legal obligations for financial transparency and governance. Now, we've got that within the policy area as well too, but what does this actually mean? Well, essentially, it isn't just on your funding agreements or how you deliver services. It's also documentation of what is the process that you actually have in terms of where is your money being spent. Do you keep your receipts? Do you have other measures that you actually report on directly to your boards? Those are the sorts of legal obligations that you need to meet and show that you've actually met those obligations as well too. The other part is raises awareness among staff and volunteers of the risk of financial abuse and everyone's role in and responsibilities in preventing, detecting, and acting on abuse. Now, a lot of this kind of discussions will come up in when you're delivering services to your clients. In charitable agencies, there are a number of services that you may deliver to vulnerable population groups. This can be children, this can be the elderly, this can be people that are in vulnerable positions, for example, under domestic violence situations or the likes. And so essentially you've got this need to have this awareness of, is it services that your agency is delivering, but more importantly, it's actually broader. So if you're in a situation where, for example, you may be delivering services to family violence, people under family violence protection orders, or even people who are elderly as well too, and staff may identify that people are abusing those particular persons. Well, it is actually your staff or volunteers' obligations to actually report those as well. So it is something that your agency needs to think about and identify how that's actually done. We also have defines, articulates, and develops an internal culture that minimizes the risk of financial abuse. And again, this may be direct reports to the boards in terms of how funding has actually been provided, how it's actually being used, and from month to month, how this is actually being managed and who signs off on this as well. Other things that we've also included is things like your policies, procedures, and systems that reduce the likelihood and consequences of financial incidents. And again, this is under the policy document that we've actually sent, that we've actually loaded into your legal resources. and specifies things like management of documentation. How long do you keep it? If someone has questions on it, who should be the one to respond to it as well too? And this includes your code of conduct as well too, in terms of meeting these governance standards. So it is something in terms of how your agency needs to meet, in terms of how you respond to it. The second part of this, which looks at the last four areas, is on how do you identify if there are suspicious activities? Does your financial software allow for this? Do you have compliance systems in place to be able to manage this as well? So essentially what you've then got here is all of these governance standards that your agency does need to actually comply with and what your agency needs to show. So again, we've actually placed this directly within your policy document that you can then utilize and actually measure whether your policy covers some of this. If not, you can essentially utilize our documentation to provide that information directly to your organization as well too, and you are able to essentially utilize this information. So that's how essentially a lot of the legal compliance obligations in essentially one slide allows you to manage and meet your specific requirements and essentially manage where and what you actually need to look at as well too. As I mentioned, the legal resources are there. We are going to be looking at risk registers next week and the reporting of these. This is one of the big areas that community service organizations do actually need to consider as part of their good governance, risk and legal compliance obligations. We will happy to stay on the line and answer any questions that people might have. If you are watching this recording after today's live session and do have any questions, then please reach out to us either on our 1300 360 360 number, or you can email us at support@gemba360.com.